You ever take a sip of champagne at a family dinner and suddenly realize it might be your last? Yeah, that happened to me. I'm Laura Bennett, 31 years old, and until last year, I thought my biggest problem was balancing my career with married life. Turns out, my real problem was that my husband and his best friend's wife were plotting against me, one poisoned glass at a time. Collision. Welcome to the Betrayal Diaries. If you love stories of shocking betrayal and ultimate revenge, hit subscribe because this one's going to keep you glued until the end. It happened at our monthly family-style dinner. My husband, Adam, raised a crystal flute of champagne and handed it to me with a smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. Across the table, Tessa, his best friend's glamorous wife, watched me too closely, her own glass untouched. Something was wrong. The bubbles fizzed oddly, the scent faintly metallic. And in that split second, memories slammed into me. The bad oysters from 2 months ago that sent me to the ER. The mysteriously spiked cocktail at Tessa's birthday. The pills Adam accidentally mixed into my vitamins that left me dizzy for days. I forced a smile, lifted the glass, and pretended to sip. My lips barely touched the rim. Adam's shoulders eased. Tessa smirked. They thought I'd taken the bait. But instead of drinking, I stood, pretending to grab more bread from the sideboard. In that moment, I swapped glasses with Tessa, quick and careless like a clumsy hostess. Oh, silly me, I always forget which one's mine, I laughed. No one blinked. Then I sat, my heart thundering, as Tessa lifted the glass meant for me and took a long sip. And that, right there, was the first crack in their perfect little plan. High voltage, don't go anywhere. Part 2 is where their scheme begins to collapse, and I finally get proof that my husband wasn't just lying, he was conspiring. Comment below, would you have drunk the champagne to keep the peace or switched glasses like I did? When people imagine betrayal, they think it comes as a scream, a fight, a dramatic confrontation. But the truth? It often slips out quietly, like poison in a glass. Tessa's hand trembled slightly as she set her champagne down. Her face paled, lips pressing tight. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to laugh at some story Adam's friend was telling, all while my eyes stayed locked on her. She glanced at Adam. That glance told me everything. Not guilt. Not concern. But fear. That was the moment I knew I hadn't been paranoid. For months, I'd brushed it all off. The bad oysters. The wrong vitamins. Adam insisting I must be stressed from work. And every single time, Tessa hovering nearby with that polished smile. Now I had proof. I excused myself, slipping into the hallway under the guise of taking a call. From there, I peeked back into the dining room. Adam was leaned close to Tessa, whispering furiously, his hand gripping hers under the table. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just sabotage. This was an alliance. My husband and his best friend's wife, together. The champagne wasn't an accident. It was strategy. I pressed my back against the wall, my phone clutched in my hand. My instinct screamed at me to storm back in, flip the table, demand the truth. But something colder, sharper, steadier slid into me. Why waste the element of surprise? I started recording. From the hallway, I captured Adam's low voice, sharp with panic. I told you to wait until she signed the Henderson contract. Without her signature, the transfer won't stick. Tessa's reply was muffled, but clear enough. She wasn't supposed to notice. I thought she'd drink it. My blood went ice cold. This wasn't just betrayal of my body, it was betrayal of my future. They were trying to push me out of my own company deal. I ended the recording, slipped my phone into my clutch, and plastered a smile back on my face before returning to the table. Adam looked up, startled. Tessa coughed, her color still off. I raised my own glass, the one I'd kept untouched. To family, I said sweetly, the rim catching the light. And as they clinked their glasses to mine, I silently vowed, this was just the beginning. High Voltage Part 3 is where the planning begins, the quiet weeks where I turned their scheme inside out. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell me in the comments, would you have confronted them right then, or played along like I did? There's a saying, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. So I didn't. Instead, I smiled through dinners, kissed Adam goodnight, and played the dutiful wife while inside. I was cataloging every slip, every whisper, every late-night text that wasn't meant for me. I started with their phones. Adam had gotten cocky, same passcode he'd used for years. Tessa? Easier. She left her phone unlocked on the counter when she came by to help Adam with contracts. A few screenshots later, I had a gallery of damning texts. Messages about timing the dosage and waiting until Laura's weak enough to hand it over. But here's the part that really made my blood run cold. It wasn't just about poisoning me. It was about my company. The Henderson account I'd spent 2 years securing, the contract was worth millions. And Adam had been coaching Tessa to swoop in, take my spot, and present it as her victory. That's when I realized this wasn't just betrayal of love. It was professional assassination. So I drew up my own plan. Step 1. Evidence. Every text, every recording, every suspicious bank transfer I duplicated, backed up, and sent to my attorney with a neat little bow. Step 2. Isolation. I slowly pulled back from Adam, not enough for him to notice, but enough that he felt comfortable. I stopped asking about his late nights. I even thanked Tessa for her help. The more at ease they felt, the sloppier they became. Step 3. The stage. A confrontation behind closed doors? Too easy to deny. I wanted witnesses. I needed an audience. And the perfect one was coming up, the Henderson Gala, where I was scheduled to present the very contract they were trying to steal. Imagine it, a room full of investors, clients, and colleagues. Exactly the crowd Adam and Tessa wanted to impress. Exactly the crowd that would watch them unravel. For weeks, I rehearsed. My outward role, the oblivious wife, smiling, supportive, sipping her wine. My secret role? The director of a play they didn't know they were starring in. And every night, lying awake in the silence of our bedroom, I repeated the same thought. They wanted me gone. Instead, I'll make them disappear. High Voltage Part 4 is where the trap is sprung. The night of the gala. The night Adam and Tessa's secrets stopped being secrets. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment. Do you think revenge is sweeter when it's private or when the whole world is watching? They say timing is everything. They don't tell you how delicious it feels to press the right button at the exact moment everyone is looking. The Henderson Gala was a cathedral of soft lights and deliberate smiles. Crystal, black tuxes, and women in gowns that whispered when they moved. The kind of room where reputations arrive early and leave polished. I walked in like I belonged because I did. My name was on the program. My face was on the invitations. Tonight was my moment. Adam and Tessa arrived arm in arm, sunglasses of confidence still warm on their faces. They smoothed their outfits, accepted compliments, and took their seats at the table that would be the picture frame for their performance. They thought they were stepping into the spotlight to take what was mine. They thought wrong. I'd planned everything with surgical care. Every file backed up in triplicate. Every recording transcribed and time-stamped. Lawyers on speed dial and a tech-savvy friend who owed me more than favors. He owed me loyalty. He'd arranged to hijack the gala's AV for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes long enough to end 2 lives as they'd known them. The MC finished his polished banter and called us to attention. The room tilted toward the stage. My palms were steady. This was rehearsal at 3 a.m. for weeks in my head, and now the cue light had finally gone on. I took the mic. "Good evening," I said, voice soft enough to be genteel, but firm enough to cut through the hum. "Before we begin, there's something I need to share. It concerns integrity, something our firm prides itself on." A polite ripple ran through the room. Cameras shifted. People leaned in. The screen behind me flickered. Instead of the planned slideshow of donor tears, my friend's laptop sang to life. Slide 1, an email thread, innocuous until you saw the subject line, Henderson pitch timeline. There it was, a draft with edits, and in the margin, a name that wasn't mine. Slide 2, a series of messages, Adam coaching Tessa about phrasing, about which clients to charm, about when Laura would be most vulnerable. Slide 3, a voice clip, recorded from the hallway a month earlier, where Adam said, in that same casual voice he used brushing crumbs from my shoulder, "She's got to be down before the presentation." A few days out, she misses it. We step in. A murmur became a question. Tessa's smile thinned. Adam's jaw clenched. I let the room live in the shock for a beat, then clicked the next slide. This one was personal. Photos of my lunches, the one where I'd been ill and brushed it off, the one where I'd excused myself because the world was spinning, paired with timestamps showing the days they'd scheduled helpful visits. Next to those, a screenshot of a text Adam had sent to an unknown number labeled only Tess B. I'll take care of the rest. Tonight. The room inhaled as one. I could see the slow peeling of composure from both of them. People glanced at Adam's colleagues, at the Henderson clients who'd been courted by both teams. Eyes narrowed. Phones came out. The flamethrower I'd planned wasn't even needed. The documents did the work. Tessa stood before she realized she'd move. This is a mistake, she began, voice high and rehearsed. But the clips kept playing. She'd been recorded early that morning, voice nervous, telling Adam she'd make sure Laura is too weak to stand. The footage was clinical and damning. Adam tried to interrupt. Laura, wait, he sounded small, a man reeling because his contingency had been dismantled in public. He reached for me across the table as if proximity could stitch deception back into truth. I stepped away from the mic and walked toward them like a woman delivering an obituary. I let the room hear the truth in my bare voice. You coached her on words. You timed the weekdays. You thought the Henderson account was worth more than my life. You were wrong. No dramatic screaming. No overturned tables. I let the evidence speak. The guests whispered. The Henderson clients exchanged looks that tightened like a contract clause being crossed out. The gala organizers froze, one of them already dialing his phone, not to call an ambulance, but to put the night's headlines on hold. Then the best part, the dominoes outside the room. A friend in procurement grabbed Adam's assistant and casually asked about revised invoices. Another colleague, tipped by my attorney, checked past presentations and noticed edits that weren't mine. When professionals who live by credibility smell rot, they don't wait for drama. They act. Security approached. Not yet to drag anyone out, but to ask questions, to preserve evidence. Adam's hand trembled when one of Henderson's executives asked him to stay for a private word after the formal program. Tessa's cheeks burned as people who'd once laughed at her jokes now nudged away. I didn't need the police at that moment. I needed the board, the clients, the room full of witnesses who would carry the story forward when lawyers started filing papers. Exposure in a field where influence is currency is harsher than any private retribution. It cuts off funding, clients, allies, everything they plan to harvest. As the event dissolved into awkward conversations and hushed goodbyes, a reporter from a local business journal approached my friend. Is there a record we can pull? She asked. We cover corporate ethics. I handed her a printed packet, every message, every rendered audio file, every time-stamped photo. For your story, I said coolly. You'll know what to do. They tried to spin it. Taken out of context, Adam said later, voice brittle. We were worried about Laura. His attempts fizzled like cheap champagne when faced with a room full of people who had heard the recordings and seen the messages. Tessa's glossy facade had cracked. She was a study in regret. Outside, under the valet lights, Adam confronted me. Laura, please, he begged. We didn't mean, his voice broke on the last word. I'd heard guilt before, its rehearsed variations. This was exhaustion and calculation both laid bare. We wanted you to miss one presentation. We never meant. Never meant. I repeated, watching him in the neon drizzle. You meant to manipulate me. You meant to poison my career. You meant to trade my health for a contract. That is what you meant. He had no answer. He fumbled for something, for words, for an excuse, for the old script of apologies he'd trotted out like a Sunday tie. Nothing fit. Tessa stood beside him, eyes red, realizing the applause she'd once banked on had become the silence of friends who'd seen too much. When I left that night, it wasn't with vindictive glee. It was with a rigid calm that felt like clearing a ledger. I'd taken their ammunition and filed it where it mattered most, with the people whose livelihoods depended on trust. In an industry where a rumor can end a career, I'd weaponized truth. Back home, my inbox erupted. Calls, emails, messages of support from the clients I'd fought for. One by one, contracts were reaffirmed by people who, after watching the presentation, chose integrity over gossip. At the same time, messages began circulating about an internal review of Adam's conduct. Tessa found herself uninvited from a charity committee she'd chaired. Little ruptures formed, then widened. But there was one last twist I hadn't fully expected. As the stories spread, someone close to Adam, not a colleague, but an old friend who had always envied his calm life, slipped a piece of information to my attorney. The bottles in Adam's office cabinet, the invoices for untraceable consultants, the small line-item purchases that didn't match the firm's ledger. My lawyer's eyes narrowed over the documents. "We need a forensic accountant," she said. "If there's a paper trail, we'll follow it." I lay awake that night thinking about thresholds. Exposure had torn down their public faces, but paper trails could bury them completely. I'd shown the world the lie. Now I could let the law do the rest. Want to know how deep the deception went and what finally ended their freedom? Part 5 is where everything falls into place. The investigations, the courtroom, and the way life can be rebuilt when justice is on your side. If you're watching this series on the Betrayal Diaries, subscribe now and tell me, was making the reveal public too cruel, or the only way to make them pay? I'll read every comment. When you spend months assembling a case out of scraps, texts, recordings, suspicious receipts, the moment the system finally takes over feels unexpectedly procedural. Not cinematic. Not the satisfying final gasp the movies promise. It's paperwork, interviews, subpoenas, and long hours in conference rooms where you sign your name until your hand cramps. But let's not pretend the climax wasn't sweet. After the gala, the first dominoes fell fast. My attorney forwarded the packet to Henderson's compliance team and to a well-connected reporter who'd promised discretion unless there was something solid. Discretion turned into urgency when the forensic accountant opened Adam's firm files and found anomalies that could not be explained away as bookkeeping errors. It started with small things, vendor names that didn't match invoices, consulting line items paid to shell vendors, and reimbursements for research supplies that had no paper trail beyond a few glossy receipts Adam had tucked into a desk drawer. Then came the bigger finds. Transfers to a personal account under Tessa's maiden name, a shadow contractor whose address led to a storage unit, and a series of micro-purchases from a chemical supply house that, when traced, matched the odd items Adam had once said were lab supplies his old college buddy needed. My lawyer sat across from me, eyes narrowed and calm. "We're looking at conspiracy to defraud, possible tampering with an employee's health, and if the toxicology supports it, attempted poisoning as an aggravating factor," she said. The words landed like measured blows. Legal language is sober and precise. It leaves no room for melodrama. But the weight of it was everything I'd hoped for and feared. Detectives served search warrants at Adam's office and at the storage unit within 48 hours. They seized the shell company paperwork, internal memos, and those tiny bottles of reagents that didn't belong in a marketing firm. Tessa's phone showed more messages than even she could spin. Witnesses who'd been intimidated into silence before began to speak when the subpoenas arrived. People who had once applauded Adam's charm now provided statements about odd deliveries and late nights in the office. And in the midst of all that, the hospital's toxicology report arrived. It lined up with what we'd suspected, traces of compounds consistent with those purchased through the shadow supplier. Not enough in my single sip to be fatal. That was Tessa's later, clumsy attempt that night, but enough to cause the symptoms I'd suffered for months. When you read about small, escalating harms on paper, they sound clinical. In court, they look like intent. Charging followed indictment. Adam and Tessa were arrested. The first time I saw them in handcuffs, not on a screen but in a courtroom holding cell, there wasn't a cinematic scream or a cinematic apology. There was the dull echo of shoes on linoleum and two people finally realizing that the script had changed and they weren't the writers anymore. Their trial was methodical. The prosecution laid the narrative out like a well-wired domino set. Texts, receipts, bank transfers, and the audio I'd recorded were not dramatic on their own, but when woven together they told a story of escalation, calculation, and callousness. Expert witnesses explained how each step increased the risk to my life. The defense tried to poke holes, to cast doubt on motive and method, but intent had been documented in their own messages and edits. The jury didn't need to be convinced of every microscopic technicality, they only needed to see a pattern. When the verdict came guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy and attempted poisoning, relief didn't explode out of me like fireworks. It poured out slowly, like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. They were sentenced to years in prison. Their careers were finished, their names unusable in the city's social ledger. The Henderson account? It stayed with my team. The clients who'd wavered returned, not because I demanded their loyalty, but because trust matters more than the flash of a rival. People asked me later whether I felt vindictive watching them taken away. The answer was complicated. Part of me felt a quiet satisfaction that the system had finally acknowledged what I'd known. Part of me felt sorrow for the marriages ruined, for the children of people who were now criminals, for the way envy deforms human beings into instruments of harm. But if there's one honest thing about that week, it's this. Justice felt like a clearing. It removed the threat that had lived in my home and my workplace for months. Life after verdict wasn't an instant return to normal. There were civil suits to shepherd, insurance claims, debriefs with HR, and a messy period where I rebuilt the trust with clients who'd been splintered by rumors. But rebuilding has its own momentum. I leaned into it. I accepted a promotion I'd once been told I wasn't ready for. I hired a small team that valued transparency. I gave a keynote at a regional conference about ethics in business, the irony of it delicious and not lost on anyone who'd followed the case. When I stepped up to that podium a year after everything began, I saw faces from the trial in the audience, some supportive, some chastened, some simply curious. I spoke about resilience, but also about the structural importance of accountability. Personally, I learned to trust my instincts again, but with new armor. Where I used to assume people's kindness was innate, I now look for consistency in action. Where I once overshared in the name of closeness, I now protect certain boundaries. That doesn't make me cold. It makes me careful. A surprising thing happened in the cracks of all this. People who'd been quietly watching reached out. Old mentors, former colleagues, and even a few friends I'd lost to the tabloids offered help, referrals, leads, and a generosity I hadn't expected. It turned out that when you stand up for yourself with evidence and control, others feel safer to stand with you. And love? It came back slowly and differently. Not because I needed it to heal, but because living openly made space for honest companionship. I started dating months after the trial ended, cautious at first, then with a little more confidence each time. The man who's now in my life, kind, honest, a person who checks in and follows through, didn't fix what was broken, but he helped me feel like risk could be taken again without fear of sabotage. He's not a dramatic character in my story. He's a quiet anchor in my everyday, and that's something I cherish. One of the last things that closed the circle for me was a small, private email from a Henderson client I'd fought hard for during the mess. "We chose integrity," it read. "We chose you." Those 4 words, chosen integrity, were worth more than any applause. So what's the takeaway? The headlines will simplify it. Wife exposes husband's plot, justice served. The truth is messier and more human. Revenge, if you want to call it that, was never an end in itself. The true payoff was reclaiming the life they tried to steal, my health, my career, my reputation, and my right to make choices without looking over my shoulder. If there's one sentence I want to leave you with, it's this. When people try to poison you, literally or metaphorically, gather evidence, build alliances, and let the truth do what it does best. It clears the path for the life you were meant to live. If you stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. Subscribe to the Betrayal Diaries for more true-tone stories of betrayal and the slow, satisfying work of reclaiming a life. Drop a comment. Would you have gone public the way I did, or handled it quietly? I read every single one.